two, three. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I ever get back. Oh, it's root for the Cubbies. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. Hey!
This is the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 14th of January, 2019. Beaming from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. Hey, Boston Red here on a Monday morning as normally quarterbacking the talk shows. What were of the talk shows? We looked at Face the Nation, kind of interesting there in terms of the journalists. I believe two were from the Washington Post, Ms. Kim. I believe she said she was out of Iowa. Anyway, nonetheless, she writes for the Washington Post. Was there anything new, revelations coming from any of the journalists? Basically, no. In terms of the shutdown, a lot of vacillation there and from what the Trump administration plans to do, does not plan to do. They had Jay Johnson on there, and he was at one time in charge of Homeland Security under Barack Obama. And he was also a lawyer at the Pentagon. And basically his commentary on DJ Trump's declaration of emergency, there are funds that have been basically were to be allocated towards places like Puerto Rico, in Florida from various hurricane damage, and to a certain extent Texas and other places. Nonetheless, these funds, since they were allocated to quote-unquote civilian projects, Mr. Johnson felt that it would be easier from a constitutional test. But if DJ Trump decided he would deal with funds that were in the military budget and not allocated for domestic affairs, it would be a bit more dicey. So I've not heard any more from those people as to where they are going or where they are not going in terms of the shutdown. The senator from, where is he, South Carolina, I suppose, had an idea perhaps of reopening the government and continuing the negotiations, consent agreement. It doesn't make much sense because, first of all, to reopen the government and then close the government back once more, that is just folly. That's all it is. And this whole idea of this government shutdown as a political weapon, and that is what the Trump administration is using it as. It has went now longer than any government shutdown in the history of the American country. That in itself is a loss. It's just not working. It will not work. So does this shutdown last for a few more weeks? Well, the pain is being felt all over the place. There's no doubt about that. From government workers, I should say contract workers. It's all out there. It's a dismal affair at best. People that clean office buildings, to people that write code for the government, to agents in Homeland Security, even the Secret Service. The stress of not knowing when your next paycheck is coming is a very, very gut-wrenching, I guess we can use that term, for many, many people that have never been exposed to that. An example would be someone out of university or out of their basic high school training and went to work, or were lucky enough to go to work to some job, and have had that job for 5 or 10 years, or out of university, 5 years, and they've had continual paychecks. They worked full-time, etc., and all of a sudden this occurs. Now with government workers, they have had some shutdowns, but they were brief shutdowns, and the consensus opinion amongst many was that this shutdown, if it occurred, would not be very long. And it is a 25% shutdown, a smorgasbord operation, with a lot of exceptions to quote-unquote who is working, who is not. Many of these people are working without pay. Never heard of that. That's involuntary servitude. Congress has voted overwhelmingly when it is over that they will get paid retroactively, and I'm assuming that once this is over, in a matter of days, those paychecks will be cut. But then the question is, why did this occur? If they go to an emergency situation to build a wall, that doesn't mean the furloughs would end. So in other words, what you have here is an incomprehensible administrative situation with no end to it. It's utterly impossible for the Trump administration to win this conflict. It just simply will not happen. So DJ Trump can let this thing go to the 4th of July. The problem there, you're going to have major breakdowns, and it will be to the point he'll have to declare a state of emergency just to literally run these departments. We're not talking about the wall. And there's some cracks in the polling. A recent poll out, and we'll go to it before we conclude here, as to what is happening in many, many places. And this even involves housing. I guess we'll go to it. We'll go to it while we're on the effects of the shutdown. This is from the public radio organization. Thousands face threats of eviction after HUD contracts expired due to shutdown. Now, this is out of the Department of Urban Housing and Urban Development with partial shutdown. And I want to start correcting something here. That basically speaking, we'll stop calling this a partial shutdown and call it a shutdown. And the reason for that is, first of all, from a historic standpoint, this particular government shutdown has went more days than any other one. And the way it is shaping up, it is affecting more people, almost 800,000 to 1 million workers. And let me just read from the copy here. This is published on the 11th of January. The partial shutdown here, that's what they're calling it, has become the longest in history. Many housing advocates fear thousands of Americans are at risk of being evicted. More than 1,000 government-backed housing contracts have already expired, and potentially more will do so in the coming weeks. The shutdown started in December. Approximately 1,150 government rental assistance contracts have not been renewed due to funding lapses at the Department of Housing there. These lapses impact project-based rental assistance agreements between private owners and the federal government. Landlords are contracted to house low and very low income residents. The property owners charge tenants modest rents, and the federal government kicks in subsidies to make up the difference. With the expiration so far of only accounts for about 5% of the project-based contracts, it's causing concern for more than 1.2 million low-income families, and this would also be disabled, etc., housed in multifamily properties that would be in danger of losing homes as the shutdown continues on. In a letter to landlords early this month, first reported by the Washington Post, the housing administration urged property owners to dip into their reserve accounts to cover funding shortfalls as a way to keep tenants in place. The National Low-Income Coalition, we'll get to them in a minute, and there's a map here, we'll also get to that. These contracts is necessary to keep about 150,000 deeply poor, mostly seniors and people with disabilities, safe and affordable housing. That is from Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Yentel worries that the President and congressional Democrats are at an impasse over a board of funding. The government will not reopen anytime soon, and it may force property owners to take business decisions that could adversely affect tenants. Ed Johnson, he is executive director of the Oakland Housing Authority, which manages approximately 550 project-based properties on behalf of the government. 2 properties he oversees, one in San Jose, another in Sacramento, California, have around 75 units between them. Johnson says neither of the properties received their January payments, so they are functioning right now without really having any income for the program to support the efforts. I am more concerned about them ending up going into foreclosure and bankruptcy on these properties than I am about them evicting the residents. So in other words, if they don't get the money, they could go in that. But the local courts can forestall that effort, and it obviously depending on the state laws, etc. Many times those can be postponed anywhere from 30 days, we should say 2 weeks, 30 days, 3 months, or 6 months there, and as part of it. And as far as a foreclosure action, that can go to a some type of bankruptcy type hearing, which develops stoppage, it's called, in the civil law. But anyway, it effectively would stop everything until the courts could get the money in there. There's a lot of latitude there. Mary Cunningham, she's vice president of the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy at the Urban Institute. She says the lapse in funding may deter other would-be tenants from entering into contract with HEW in the future. There are many, many long-term consequences of this, and that is part of the problem. On Saturday, the shutdown became the longest in history, and is coming, and in the coming weeks, 500 HUD more will expire at the end of this month, 550 at the end of September. A terrible situation here. The HUD has more than 20,000 contracts with owners of multifamily developments. When it comes to payments, typically reliable. This is how it usually works. The property owners' houses, mild and low-income residents, and some modest income residents also. This is the report. Actually, this is an interview here. Diane Yentel, funding for these contracts necessary to keep the 150,000 there. And actually, wait a minute here. Let's see if we can go. I thought there was some audio here. We can just go to the audio, and hopefully we can go to the audio. We'll try. We'll see.
The partial government shutdown has put many low-income renters and their landlords on edge, and here's why. They rely on money from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that amounts to subsidies, but HUD told property owners that they won't be getting that money during the shutdown, and they should use their own funds to compensate. With no end in sight, housing advocates say hundreds of thousands of Americans face the risk of being evicted from their homes. NPR's Brackton Booker reports.
HUD has more than 20,000 contracts with owners of multifamily housing developments. When it comes to payments, HUD is typically reliable. This is how it usually works. The property owner houses multiple low and very low income residents, charges them modest rents, and HUD kicks in subsidies to make up the difference. But at the start of the new year, HUD said roughly 1,150 property contracts were not renewed as a result of the shutdown. And that has Diane Yintel very concerned.
Funding these contracts is necessary to keep about 150,000 deeply poor, mostly seniors and people with disabilities, safely and affordably housed.
Yintel is the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. She worries that with President Trump and congressional Democrats at an impasse over border wall funding, the government won't open anytime soon.
And eventually, these owners will have to resort to either really significant rent hikes or evictions of these lowest income renters.
HUD says the vast majority of project-based rental assistance projects are funded through February, but acknowledges as the shutdown continues, more contracts will expire. Eric Johnson is the executive director of the Oakland Housing Authority. He works with two properties in the region, one in San Jose and the other in Sacramento, with about 75 housing units between them. He says neither got a January payment from HUD.
And so they're functioning right now without having really any income from the program to help support their efforts.
HUD is asking these and other owners to dip into their reserve accounts to cover any money that HUD is unable to release. Johnson adds many property owners won't be able to operate indefinitely from their reserve funds. This puts owners of low-income housing units between a rock and a hard place. Johnson says that's bad for the stability of the housing market overall.
Well, one of the issues here, the HUD and the Trump administration, their philosophy on housing has been very draconian. They would like to eliminate by severely, modifying requirements for low-income housing, that the low-income people could no longer basically pay the rent. This is part of what they are attempting to do. So once more, this is just a policy that would be out there. I'm looking at the map here, and if we go up to Washington State, I see a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, more than 10 of the types of contracts in Washington State. California has many, many of those, and so does the state of Texas, and they're all over Florida. Impossible to tell how many looking at this. Whereas if you go to the Midwest, there are less in, say, the Dakotas, and out in places like Montana, Wyoming, etc. But if you go to places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, you will find many of those types of projects. And all through other areas that you will see those projects going on. So this is a multifamily assistance, Section 8 from the housing people as to where things stand there. And there's also, just looking at their site here, Low Income Housing Coalition, some of the cuts that were coming forward before this actually happened. So in other words, this is not something new. It just exacerbates the entire situation. And it has continued from food sufficiency on. These are actions that have continually impact people. And just looking at their release here, on the partial shutdown. This organization has sent a letter to the congressional leadership, issued a press release on the efforts of dealing with HUD. Let's go to the press release very, very quickly. Affordable housing leaders demand end to government shutdown, passage of full year spending. Now, that is the solution across the whole situation here. This is a coalition here as it calls upon the shutdown's impact on the stability of low-income government contractors, security guards, cafeteria servers, etc. that live evidently paycheck to paycheck. And the statement here of Yantel, I suppose, the longer the shutdown, the more of the lowest income people will be hit, no doubt about that. Period. So we have to start looking at this a little bit different from just saying it's a partial shutdown to it is a shutdown. Disaster for me is low-income families, seniors, people with disabilities that depend upon HUD for safe and stable housing. Funding uncertainty puts more than 2 million voucher households at risk of losing their homes. A lack of operating fund payments will force public housing authorities to shut down units that could be repaired or properly maintained. So in other words, this thing goes has a very, very long reach. The bottom line is for us is care and concern for people who we serve. The shutdown will hurt them. That is from Deborah DeSantis. Every hour the deadlock drags on means people who really need housing and services are not going to get them. The longer the critical agencies stay shuttered, the more likely it is families, children, and individuals now counting on help to stay housed and healthy will have their lifelines cut off. And this is part of it. There's 10 million people out here, nearly 10 million who live in HUD-assisted housing, and that is part of the problem here. That Enterprise Community Partners President Laurel Blanchford, Congress and the administration must find ways to restore funding. Well, this is why the process is a very, very long process. Lending Partners President Katie Sloan Smith, all NGOs and nonprofits rely on regular and adequate funding to provide quality, affordable housing to some of the nation's low-income older adults. The average adult on a Section 202 housing for elderly program has an annual income of $13,000, far too little to make ends meet in the private housing market. More than 400,000 older adults rely on a Section 202 program, while another 1.2 million rely upon HUD programs for assistance. We urge Congress to move forward. These 1.6 million older adults have a stable housing and dignity. This is the reason we went to this much longer press release here. The National Association for County, Community, and Economic Development Executive Director here is Laura DeMarker. These programs provide vital service and resources to low-income families, and basically the same line is being repeated. Federal government and prolong it makes matters worse. Capital expenses that require approval from HUD. Employees are left undone. Housing vouchers are not reaching families in need there. So in other words, this exacerbates the homeless problem. This is a very, very volatile situation, no doubt about that. Let's go now to the Washington Post. And this is an opinion piece out of Florida. We were covering a pardon there in Florida, around Lake Florida, that had happened in 1949 of some young men were falsely accused of a rape. Of course, they're all dead now, and they were pardoned posthumously. The voters of Florida passed a constitutional amendment that restored voting rights to roughly 1.4 million former felons, a measure that undid a feature of state law enacted after the Civil War by racist lawmakers designed to disenfranchise African Americans. Now the Florida Republicans who oppose the ballot measure, written unambiguously to self-executing, insist clarifying the legislation is needed. The sounds like mischievous intention to thaw voters, and will maintain a system under which at least 1 in 5 African Americans in Florida face that's 20%, a lifetime ban on voting. This is enough to keep the reactionaries in power, barring ex-convicts from the polls, even after they've served their sentence in full, was once a distinctly American phenomenon meant to impede African Americans from wielding electoral power. No other Western democracy has erected a similar barrier. A few places it was that was implemented, as in Florida, draconian laws for minor crimes, selective enforcement like writing a bad check, ensnails African Americans and ensures that they'll never be able to cast a vote. In 1940, 3% of adult African American voters were registered in Florida. Today, disproportionate shares of disenfranchised former felons are African Americans. Under Charlie the Tuna Crisp, when he was governor of Florida, he modified the ban so that many offenders could petition to have their rights restored, would be submitted automatically. Old Rick Scott, who is now a senator, scrapped those reforms, and in place he established an arbitrary, slow, and cumbersome system. This is part of the reason that Florida, an outlaw state, it has been utterly impossible there, virtually, to win a national election there. It was stolen from Albert Gore in 2000. Barack Obama managed to literally squeeze by and carry Florida. It did not happen with Hillary Monster Clinton in 2016. And this is one of the reasons in Florida, with some other problems that they have, homegrown problems they have in Florida. There's a substantial older population, which is a primary reactionary in Florida. And there are some other misinformed people in the population that has problems. However, the mayor of Tallahassee, Florida, managed to an African American, Andrew Gillum, managed to come very close to being elected governor in Florida. Whereas in a lackluster campaign there, the Senator Nelson, a former astronaut, came a little closer, but no cigar. Thus, Scott was able to get in. Not only that, felons are disenfranchised. The President, Governor DeSantis, was the Secretary of State and was able, no, that's in Georgia. Anyway, it's almost about the same. A federal judge condemned the system as a sham, and against that backdrop of injustice, advocates have managed to put the Amendment 4 on the last ballot. And on Election Day, 65% of Floridians agreed. As a result, Florida vote, only Kentucky, Iowa, and Virginia retain rules that automatically impose lifetime bans on felons, barring an executive action. In Virginia now, the former governor there, Terry McCulloch, restored voting rights to more than 170,000 people. But in Tallahassee, Florida, may be clinging to remnants of the past there. There's no doubt about that. Voting rights advocates are alert for landmines that may be laid by DeSantis, a known racist, and other Republicans who, in a state with a notorious history of electoral squeakers, may fear the consequences. Even a small fraction of those 1.4 million. 1.4 million would not seem like very many, but for many, many states, that would be a majority of the voters in the states, especially when you go to the West and places like North, South Dakota, Wyoming, etc. And they get 2 senators out of the deal. So this is a very, very important situation that needs to be attended to in Florida, which means much, much more grassroots work has to be done there in Florida. And the Women's March is coming up, and that is another issue that the various racist elements have tried to undermine the Women's March in the state of Illinois. There won't be one in Chicago, but there will be in other cities in Illinois. It all revolves around one of the oldest tricks in the book, the leadership of the National Women's March, claiming that some of the leadership there is anti-Semitic because of their views towards the Zionist state that has been declared Zionism is racism. And this is an issue that will plague progressive people until such time as a majority of the progressives, is what's happening now in Birmingham, Alabama. Angela Davis, a woman that has fought all of her life for liberty, for voting rights, for prisoners' rights, against racism, was awarded a prize. It had to Fred Shuttlesworth, a long time serving late Fred Shuttlesworth, a late minister in Birmingham. And some little commission that gave the award rescinded the award. And the Uncle Toms that were on the board there have now all resigned. And this commission, the complaint was that Angela Davis is one of the people that is sponsoring the boycott of the Zionist state for their inhumane treatment of Palestinians. Now that is a political issue, and it's an international political issue. So what these clowns have literally done is put the spotlight there. Angela will be there in February, and they will have an alternative ceremony that will take care of that. And instead of, say, having a ceremony that would have been in the Birmingham newspaper, probably making the front page and the TV in Birmingham, and being a note in many other publications and media outlets, now it will be, in the old newspaper term, page 1. And it will go all over the world. And they will understand these mischievous schemes by these Zionists. And what it's done is, as the mayor of Birmingham so eloquently stated, it is a step backward, not a step forward. And it brings about hostility amongst people that should be a common situation. It's unfortunate. It was opportunist. And as the political leader Joseph Stalin once said, opportunism for a day, but it soon disappears. And this is basically what's happening there. They understand the time is running out. The clock has run out on them. And the game is, in other words, the jig is basically up. Now they're starting to try the same thing on the newly elected House representative from Michigan, out of Detroit there, that has taken up the seat that the freedom fighter John Conyers, a friend of the Palestinian people, occupied for many years. So in other words, it's the same situation. Some of these forces are also with Ocasio out of the Bronx, representative there, and various other social democrats. These people are not social, the social democrats. But the Democratic Party is moving too far to the left. Well, the situation is the Democratic Party is not moving too far to the left. It has not moved far enough. But this is a decision that has to be made in the Democratic Party. For those of us that are not in the Democratic Party but are still progressives, yes, we can propagandize for Bernie Sanders. We can propagandize for Liz Warren and people like Beto O'Rourke. But the ultimate decision will be made as to what the Democratic Party does or does not do through these primaries, caucuses, and the officials of the Democratic Party. It's a preference, a selection. Now, when it goes to the general election and all the voters, independents, in-betweens, you name it, come out there, is what happened in 2016. The Democratic Party stole the election of the primaries from Bernie Sanders, put Hillary the Monster Clinton out there, and we as progressives rejected that selection. And now you have a DJ Trump. So this is an issue that has to go on. And one of the things, particularly for new progressives, it's time. As Barack Obama said, former President Barack Obama, it'll take more than one president, no doubt about that, and you have to get more than one progressive president elected. And that could take years. I mean, this struggle could go on for another 10 or 20 years before the sides went out, the progressive people went out. That's sort of like the struggle in Palestine, that the Palestinians win their land back and win their nation. That will take years. They've been struggling since 1949. And thousands of Palestinians have been murdered. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of land have been stolen. And yet they're portrayed by some as a people that call themselves Palestinians. Well, the people have a right to call themselves anything they wish. That is the right of people under the UN Universal Declaration of Rights. And that is the problem that these people have. So when you go all over the world, you go to China, being people there, you go to India, you go to Europe, you go to any civilized place on the planet of the earth, you'll see that the Palestinian cause is well received. Yet in the U.S., as in Florida, we have backward elements that are holding on. Now, that is part of their discretion. They can advocate anything that they wish. It's just that if they enter into a national dialogue in the House of Representatives or the Senate or wherever, that they have to represent the interests of the people. And what is happening more and more every day, the interest of the people is changing. Look at the polling. Bernie Sanders, had he run against DJ Trump, would have won that election. Now they can run around and talk about the Democratic Party moving too far to the left if they wish. That's their prerogative. They can talk about it all day. But if the Democratic Party does not adjust to 2019 and 2020 reality, they could once again come up short. Now that does not mean that a moderate type Democrat could hustle the nomination up and enough people decide, we don't know what DJ Trump's going to do, to not re-elect DJ Trump. But does that mean any real progress? No. That's the same scheme that happened to us when Bill Clinton came in. Bill Clinton came in as a so-called change agent. Well, he was a change agent for reaction. More African-American males ended up in jail. Families were kicked off of and destroyed the safety net. We had the old neoliberal type of schemes, public-private partnership. Yes, you had a boom, the tech boom, but then we had a recession, and then we got G.W. Bush. So much of this. Let's move on here. Let me just check the time here. We don't want to time along too much. We have the Face the Nation commentary coming up. So we'll do the sports, but, snowstorms in the Midwest. 9 people are dead so far. 1 state trooper. We started talking about this. There's 9 people in the Midwest. It continues. That started out on Friday in Missouri. Among them, a 53-year-old woman in Missouri. And there's just some of the instances happened in Missouri. Stranded motorists, 1,790 crashes, 876, 57 injuries, and 4 fatalities in the state of Missouri. And then you go into the Chicago area and the Illinois State Patrol and so forth and so on there and in Missouri. Let's do the sports now. And we'll start with the NBA. We are not broadcasting. Oops. We keep having problems here. We'll return to the NBA scores. All right. The 76ers were at the Knicks in New York. 76ers 108-105 in overtime. The Raptors were in Washington with the snow. It was 140-138. The Raptors there. The Bucks were at the Hawks in Atlanta. The Bucks 133-114. The Rockets were at the Magic. Magic 116-109 for the Rockets. The Warriors were at the Mavericks in Big D, Dallas. Warriors 119-114, and the Trailblazers were in the Mile High City, Denver. Nuggets 116-103, and the Cavaliers were in Los Angeles and beat the Lakers 101-95. On to the NHL, Major League Hockey. Never did minor league hockey, so I'm not really sure about who is there. Anyway, all right. The Predators and Hurricanes, the final there. Hurricanes 6-3. The Rangers and Blue Jackets. The Blue Jackets 7-5 was the final in that one. The Anaheim Ducks and the Winnipeg Jets in an overtime game. It was the Jets 4-3. The Lightning and the Islanders 5-1. The Islanders over the Lightning, and the Panthers and Canucks. It was Canucks 6-1. And finally, the Coyotes and Flames. The Flames 7-1 was the final score there. This will do it for the Monday morning quarterback. Boston Red from the Jared Pippin broadcast booth on a Monday morning. Incidentally, we open up this program with Harry Carey and usually Hillary Clinton singing "Take Me Out to the Ballpark." It is 20 years ago. In 2000? No, excuse me. It was in in the late 19. Let me see, 2000. It was in 1988, so it was 21 years ago. Anyway, have a good week, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Incidentally, we had some very sad news. Harry Reid has pancreatic cancer. We're going to do a special on Harry Reid, and there was an article written about him. I think it was in the New Yorker, and he did an interview with the public radio station in Nevada. He's living in Henderson, Nevada now. Harry Reid, the former leader of the Senate, the man that championed the Affordable Care Act through the Senate. Good day.